So this morning, we are in the book of Ruth, and it is a book that for many of us, we might be a little familiar with. It's been a few years since I've preached from Ruth. We did a series back one summer, probably 5 years ago, on the book of Ruth. And so we are going to really in one Sunday cover the entire book. You will see that kind of in the flow of the Old Testament, Ruth is kind of a side note and kind of a side trip that we're going to take this week, and then we will, it kind of sets up moving into David for next week. And so I want you to kind of see some things, and we're going to talk a little bit as Ruth gets started, but you'll see there, if you have your Bibles, Ruth chapter 1, verse 1 is where we will start, and it sets up our context and sets up where we are going with this. It says, during the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land. A man left Bethlehem in Judah with his wife and 2 sons to stay in the territory of Moab for a while. So this sets up kind of what's happening and what we're about to see, kind of how this all transpires. This is during the time of the judges. And if you remember what's going on during the time of the judges is Judges ends on a very, very sour note. You can see there, Judges, the very last verse of Judges says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever seemed right to him. That's where we end. So the verse, just before the verse we just read in Ruth, this is where we end Judges. It is not a good time for the people of God. They are doing whatever they want to do, and it is not a good time. So a famine strikes the land, and as the famine strikes the land, they go and they move to Moab. And so this family leaves Bethlehem, they leave their home, they move to Moab. So let's go back, Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, and we'll go through. We're going to read down through verse 5, and we'll probably stop here pretty quick as we start to read. So back to verse 1. In the time of Judges, there was famine in the land. A man left Bethlehem in Judah with his wife and 2 sons to stay in the territory of Moab for a while. Verse 2, the man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. The name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. Now, let's just pause here. We've been talking a lot about names as we have gone through this series in the Old Testament. 2 weeks ago, we were talking about Moses, and I made a great plea that if you have daughters, that you should name them Shiphrah or Puah, that those were very heroic women names. And some of you probably thought Shiphrah and Puah are not very good names. Well, do you want to know what names are worse? Those names are Mahlon and Chilion. Mahlon means sickness. Chilion means death. So just process it for a moment. Here are my 2 sons. This is my son, Sicky Sickerson, and his little brother, Dethi Detherson. These are terrible names. And if you name your kids Sick, and you name your other child, or you name your son Sick and your other child Death, do you know what's going to happen to them? Not good things. We have a friend who's their son, his middle name is Fury. And when they named their child Fury, my friend called them and was like, what are you doing? You know this child is going to be out of control. Don't name your kid Fury. Now, thankfully, he's a senior in high school this year, and he's a good kid. They have survived the Fury thus far. But don't name your kid Sicky Sickerson or Dethi Detherson. Not good names, okay? So don't Shiphrah Puah, I'm still behind. Mahlon and Chilion, I'm not behind. So here we are. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They enter the fields of Moab and settle there. So they have left their home as we move into into verse 3, and it says, Naomi's husband, Elimelech, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Her sons took Moabite women as their wives. One was named Orpah, and the second's name was Ruth. After they lived in Moab about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. Just so you know, that's what happens when you name your kid Sick and Death. And the woman was left without her 2 children and without her husband. So this is kind of where we land in the story at this point. Process kind of what all's going on. So they have left their home in Bethlehem. They have moved to Moab. Her 2 sons took Moabite wives, different religion, different culture, has taken Moabite wives, and her husband has died, and both her sons have died, and they were married for 10 years. Now, outside of grandma, in today's culture, if you're married for 10 years and you don't have any kids, there's a little bit of understanding. But in their culture, the goal of being married, the goal of life is to pass on a legacy through your children, primarily male children. So you think through, her 2 sons were married 10 years, no children. That's a long time in their culture to not have children. So this is what's going on in their world. At this point in the story, Naomi has dealt with famine. She's dealt with her sons marrying Moabite women. She's gone 10 years with no children. She has a husband that dies. She has sons that die. She's left with 2 Moabite women. That's all that she has. Life has been unfair. The struggle of her life has been unfair. And so often when we talk about the struggle of someone in the Bible, we look to Job, but here we find Naomi, and it's not that different of a story. It is a woman who has struggled. It is a woman who has seen incredibly hard times. So we continue to pick up the story. So let's go to verse 6. It says, she and her daughters-in-law set out to return from the territory of Moab because she had heard in Moab that the Lord had paid attention to his people's need by providing them food. She left the place where she had been living, accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-law, and they traveled along a road leading back to the land of Judah. Naomi said to them, each of you go back to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to me, or shown to the dead and to me. May the Lord grant each of you rest in the house of a new husband. She kissed them and they wept loudly. They said to her, we insist on returning with you to your people. But Naomi replied, return home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? I am unable to have any more sons who could become your husbands. Return home, my daughters, go on, for I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight, and to bear sons, would you be willing to wait for them to grow up? Would you restrain yourselves from remarrying? No, my daughters, my life is much too bitter for you to share, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. Again, they wept loudly, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Naomi said, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Follow your sister-in-law. In verse 16, and this is kind of the statement and the most famous statement in the book of Ruth, verse 16 and 17, but Ruth replied, don't plead with me to abandon you or return and to not follow you, for wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me and do so severely if anything but death separates you and me. So in the story, just to kind of make sure that we all kind of know what all is going on in the story, if you were to finish up chapter 2, if you finish up chapter 1 into chapter 2, they return back to Bethlehem. Ruth stays with Naomi, and then we get down to verse 20 where they have returned. Life has been very bad to them, and Naomi comes back to her people, and her people are all excited because she's returned home. She has a farm, she has land, all of these things are great. And Naomi makes this statement to the people, don't call me Naomi, but call me Mara. She answered, for the Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full. I went away with a husband, with 2 sons. I went away with hope. I went away with promise. But the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has opposed me and the Almighty has afflicted me? So Naomi wants to change her name to bitter. And this is where we kind of pick up this story and where we kind of begin to see ourselves a little bit in it. Chapter 1 ends with Naomi as a bitter woman, but this bitterness is justified. She's had a hard life. She left Bethlehem with a husband. She's left Bethlehem with sons, with hope, with promise. And now she's returned as a bitter woman. One of the statements that we have added through this series onto our watchword at the end is barrenness doesn't get the last word, but hope does. And I think we could say for Naomi that it's not just barrenness that she is dealing with, though she is dealing with her two daughters-in-law. But she's dealing with bitterness, with brokenness, with a loss of hope. These are the things that have been weighing down upon her. And so the question that I have is I don't think Naomi is that different than you and I. The things that we hope for, the things that we want, we might not have been broken in the way that Naomi is. We might not be in the place of Naomi saying, I need to change my name to bitterness. But where do we turn? Where do we go in those times of bitterness? Where do we go in those times of brokenness? Where do we go in those times of barrenness? Where are the places that we seek God in those moments? Because I know for most of us, we can identify with Naomi and say, life has been hard. Life has been so bad, I think I need to change my name to better represent where I stand. I need to be called bitterness. What do we do with that? Well, I know kind of the easy answer, the Sunday school answer, would be, well, we just need to turn to God, and that is true, and that's where we're going to land. But what I want you to see is, in the story of Ruth, in the book of Ruth, there is one big theme that goes throughout the entire book. And the theme of the book of Ruth is not bitterness, but the theme of the book instead is God's loving kindness. His steadfast love. The word in Hebrew, and I've preached about it before, is the word hesed. That we understand and we see through these statements and we see through this story that God is present, that God is working in the midst of these valleys, in the midst of these incredibly hard times. God is still there, that God is still present. And the book of Ruth continues to point us back to God's loving kindness, begins to point us back to see that the hesed, that the loving kindness of God is a reminder of God's action in our lives. We look through this book and we see and we look at our own lives and we see that if we live a life where God is blessing us, it's very easy. We have an overflowing life. We have a life where the world sees that I am successful. We have no worries. We have no suffering, and all of that looks good. Or we could live this other life where we feel like Naomi, where God has dealt with us severely. The markers of success aren't evident in our lives. There is suffering, there is barrenness, there is hopelessness, there is brokenness, and ultimately there is bitterness. But in those moments, we also tend to see God. It's in those hard moments that we see God's loving kindness, His mercy. It's in those moments that we see Him working. It's in those moments that we turn to verses like Psalm 31. If you want to turn over there, Psalm 31 is this incredible statement by David of a plea for protection, but it's also his statement of God's loving kindness. Look at verse 7. David says to us, I will rejoice and be glad in your faithful love because you have seen my affliction. Now, I moved over a little bit too quickly. Faithful love, Hebrew there, do you know what that is? Hesed. I will rejoice and be glad in your faithful love, in your steadfast love, because you have seen my pain. You've seen my brokenness. You have seen my hurt. You know what troubles my soul. Now, you can go on and you can read through this incredible psalm. And as you read through the incredible psalm, this isn't up on the screen, but I want you to hear some of these words. You have not handed me over to my enemy. You have set my feet in a spacious place. Be gracious to me, Lord, because I am in distress. My eyes are worn out from frustration. My whole being as well. Indeed, my life is consumed with grief, my years with groaning. My strength has failed because of my iniquity, and my bones waste away. I am ridiculed by all my adversaries, and even my neighbors. I am dreaded by my acquaintance. Those who see me in the street run from me. I am forgotten, gone from memory, like a dead person, like broken pottery. I have heard the gossip of the many. Terror is on every side. When they conspire against me, they plotted to take my life. And then verse 14. But I trust in you, Lord, and I say you are my God. Then look at 15 and 16. Of course, the course of my life is where? In your power. All of these bad things have happened to me. All of this brokenness, all of this affliction, all of this has happened to me. But the course of my life is with you. Rescue me from the power of my enemies and from my persecutors. Verse 16, make your face to shine on your servant. Save me by your steadfast or faithful love. This is one of those incredible passages where we remember who God is and what God is doing. So we move through the story of Ruth. And in the midst of the story of Ruth, we leave Naomi here as bitter and broken. And we can go through the story, and most of you kind of might know a little bit about the story, but Ruth goes out, she meets a man named Boaz. Boaz is what is called a goel, which he has the ability to redeem their family, a kinsman redeemer. And so they end up getting married, and they end up having a child. So we get to the very end of the book. So if you flip back over to Ruth, you get to the very end of Ruth, chapter 4, verse 13 through 17. Ruth marries Boaz. Verse 13, Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. He slept with her, and the Lord granted conception to her. And she gave birth to a son. The woman said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you without a family redeemer today. May his name be well known in Israel. Verse 15, he will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. Indeed, your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons has given birth to him. Naomi took the child, placed him on her lap, and became a mother to him. The neighborhood women said, a son has been born to Naomi, and they named him Obed. Now, just pause here for a moment and take in what's going on. Naomi, without child, without grandchild, without heir. Now there is a little boy in her lap that she is holding, and they name him Obed. And who is Obed? Well, we see there, Obed is the father of Jesse. And who was Jesse? Well, Jesse is the father of David. And the brokenness of Naomi's life is filled with God's loving kindness, that what God did through this woman's brokenness isn't just give her a son, but made her the great-grandmother of the greatest king in Israel's history. Now, here's part of the problem for us. Not all of life works out that way, does it? When we go through hard times, not all of it just ends up in us. I'm going through some bad times, but hey, a few generations later, my grandson's going to be the greatest king of Israel. What do we do with this story today? I try, I don't know if y'all know this or not, but I try to not tell too many running stories, and so I try to keep it to a minimum. But just coming back from the Grand Canyon this week, I will tell you what I was thinking about on Tuesday morning about 7 o'clock as I was coming through the Grand Canyon. I was thinking about Naomi. It's not the greatest thing to think about, but that's what I was thinking about. What I was also thinking about is there's a section in the Grand Canyon That section in the Grand Canyon, I have a picture of it. It's called the box. When you leave Phantom Ranch, you can see there on this map, you see up there where it says Bright Angel Creek on the bottom and on the top. You go through Phantom Ranch and the canyon tightens up. And it gets incredibly tight. There's a stream that runs next to you called Bright Angel Creek, and that stream runs next to you, and you cross it 5 different times. There's 5 bridges in the box, and the canyon just tightens in on you. It's like a big hug from the Grand Canyon. If you ask me, this is my favorite part of the whole Grand Canyon. I love it. But we were driving up to the Grand Canyon on Monday. My friend Chris, we got to talking, and he said, I hate the box. He said, it is my least favorite part of the whole canyon. And I was like, Chris, what are you talking about? Like, it's the very best part of the canyon. And we started talking about it, and I realized part of what I love about the box is it tightens in on you, and when I enter it, I come in, we leave at 3 in the morning, so by the time I get to the box, it's just before 7 o'clock in the morning. And so that picture on the left was Tuesday morning, and it actually is brighter in that picture because our phones are amazing. It's brighter in that picture than it was. I had just taken my headlamp off. And I come into the box, and it was dark, and the canyon tightens in on you. And I was thinking about Naomi. And these words kept going through my head. And they're words that all of you know so well. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? Because you are with me. And guys, I could come up here every week and I could talk, and I do it regularly, talk about God's presence. I've preached whole sermons on God's presence, that God is with you. But sometimes what we miss is, even in those moments where the world closes in on us, where we live in the midst of brokenness, where we don't see there's any way out, where we are completely surrounded, that even in those moments that God is with us. And I think part of what I love about the box so much is that the way that I time it, and it's just kind of the way that it happens, when I go into the box, it's dark. But when I come out of the box, the sun has fully risen. John, I might have skipped a slide in there. I think I have a picture. This is what it looks like when you come out of the box. The sun hits the rock on the other side, and there is life on the other side of walking through that valley. Guys, what I want you to hear this morning is that when we are in the midst of that valley, when we are in the midst of that brokenness, that God is with us, that God is present. Now, the story of Ruth is a story of God's loving kindness. And I made a statement earlier in the sermon. It is in the brokenness of life where we most easily see God's loving kindness. And how do we see that? Well, we see it because God is present. And how do we see God's presence? We see God's presence in one another. That we walk through this life together. One of the things, and I could talk to y'all about this a really long time, but one of the things that happened to me Tuesday in the Grand Canyon, I was struggling climbing out. It was just a hard day. And I got to a bridge. You can Google it. It's called the Red Wall Bridge. We do not call it the Red Wall Bridge. We've renamed it. We call it the Bridge of Doom. Because when you get to the Bridge of Doom, life is over. It is the worst thing ever. We all hate it. It is the hardest climb you've ever climbed in your whole life when you leave the Bridge of Doom. On Tuesday, I crossed the Bridge of Doom, and there was a man right behind me. He had ace bandages on both knees. He's wearing a white t-shirt. And I asked him, I said, how are you doing? He's like, I'm not doing good. And he said, this was a one-day, I started yesterday morning. This was a one-day adventure for me. I slept on a picnic table in the bottom of the canyon last night. So his one-day crossing turned into a two-day crossing. His name was Steve. Steve and I hiked together a little bit, He's retired from Honeywell. He lives in Ohio. And as we walked, he stopped and he asked me, he said, "What do you do for a living?" I said, "Well, I'm a pastor." When you answer the question like that, the hike was over. Steve stopped, and he stood there on the side of the Grand Canyon. We could still see the Bridge of Doom, and told me his entire life story. A story about his wife leaving their family, their 3 children when they were teenagers. He went 10 years without speaking to his wife. He hasn't seen his wife in 12 years. And last month, he texted his wife and he said, I just want to have coffee with you. And he told me, he said, I sat down across the table from her. It's the first time I've seen her face to face in 12 years. And he said, I said to her, I know you've done some bad things, but I want to apologize for anything that I've done. And I want you to know that you have 9 grandkids that you need to be a part of their lives. And as we talked, I asked Steve, I said, Steve, why did you say that to her? She left you. Why did you ask, or why did you tell her you forgave her? And he said, because I kept thinking, what would a heavenly Father do? And the way that God would respond to her is to say, I forgive you. And that's more important to me than knowing that I'm right. Think about that. It's more important for me to forgive her than to know that I'm right. And to me, that's God's loving kindness. It's the way a father shows that love. But what I want you to hear this morning is that we walk through these valleys together. We walk through these valleys with God, and we have a God that wants to be with us. But one of the ways that we walk through these valleys as we walk is to understand and to know that we don't walk alone. The great passage that we read in Ruth, I've just got kind of a little synopsis of it up here. The great passage that we read that Ruth says to her mother-in-law Naomi in her mother-in-law's darkest moment is, wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. These are the words that are spoken from Ruth to Naomi to say, I am with you. Wherever you go, I am with you. And as we wrap up Ruth this morning and just take one Sunday to go through this little fascinating book, this is what I want us to do. Some of us, we've been in the valley. Some of us, we've lived in the box. The world has tightened in on us. And I want you to know 2 things this morning. Number 1, though you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you are not alone, for God is with you. And the way that God is with us is not just a promise that God is there, though that promise is true. The way that we walk through the valley is that God is with us and that we are with us. And this morning, I want to close in a little bit of a different way that some of you are going to be uncomfortable, and it might be a flop, and it might not work at all, but I'm praying that it works. There may be some of us this morning say, you know what, Pastor, I'm in the valley. I've been in the valley for a little while, and I don't think anybody's actually with me. That this morning as we sing, that maybe some of us just need to stand and come forward and to say, I'm struggling. You don't have to tell us what's going on. You don't have to tell us your story. I'm not going to give you a microphone to tell us the whole thing. Just for you to be able to stand up front and say, I need to know that somebody's behind me. I need to know that somehow in the midst of this, I feel way more like Naomi at the beginning of the story and bitter. And I need to know not just that God is with me, but that there's someone else walking behind me. Do we have the courage to come forward and to stand and just say, I need to know. I need to be reminded that God is here and that God is present. Whatever it is I'm facing. So the first step of this is to invite you, if you want to come and just find somewhere to stand, if you want to kneel, however you want to do it. And then I think y'all all know what the next piece is. The next piece is to remind those people that there is somebody behind them, that there is somebody praying for them. And you don't have to come up and you don't have to pray a fancy prayer, just to put a hand on somebody, to remind them that there is someone praying for them, that there is someone who says, wherever you go, I'm there. Whatever it is you're facing, I'm there. You are my people, and I want you to know I am with you. So as we sing, I just invite, if anybody wants to come, we're not going to close like we normally do, but if you want to come and just find a place to stand, a place to kneel, if you can't do either of those, you want to find a place to sit, just wherever you want to do. Just to come and find a place, because as your church, we want to be able to remind you and tell you, you are not alone. We're with you. And we want today to be an opportunity to just put a hand on you and pray for you. So as we sing, I just invite you to come. If you want to come and find a place, would you come? And then once people come forward, the rest of us, if we would just come and surround them and just lay that hand on them. Let us stand as we sing.